What are smears in hand-drawn animation? Often known as elongated in-betweens, swipes, and hand-drawn motion blurs, they are frames that help describe and strengthen fast movements. If you've seen my video on squash and stretch, I briefly talked about having to redistribute the mass evenly so your animation doesn't look like it's breaking solid form. However, I also talked about if you don't redistribute the mass and just widen an object without squashing it, it will make it look like a smear. So here's a ball moving from left to right. Notice how there's no added effects that emphasize the movement. Here's the same movement with the squash and stretch principle. Notice how whenever the ball squashes or stretches, the mass redistributes itself, keeping form. Now here's where I don't redistribute the mass for the ball. Notice how it just looks like a strobe or a smear. Kind of looks like a still photo where a fast moving objects just appear as a blur, doesn't it? That's the same idea here. Smears and hand-drawn motion blurs can come in many different styles. There's no real rule to how a smear should look. Smears again can come in many different styles and form. Some use repeated imagery of previous frames to show a smear, or some use speed lines to show this. Some are more stylized, graphic, or comic. It really depends on the style and art direction you're gunning for. So why use smears? I can only think of a few reasons. It can emphasize and strengthen the look of a movement. It can be used to stylize quick movements. And probably the most important reason of all, it can fully describe movements that are invisible to the naked eye. You see, the human brain can't process every single movement or frame of something moving, especially if this something is moving at an incredibly high speed. They'll know the context of the action, but they won't necessarily feel it because the human brain needs information that describes that power of movement in a short amount of time. We can see a lot of frames per second in real life, but seeing isn't the same as perceiving and feeling a very fast movement. Sometimes we might need to merge ideas together to feel this sort of movement. Here is a monk doing a karate chop. We can see and understand the context of the movement, but it all happens at a blink of an eye, and we might miss out the subtle description of the motion. Here is the same chop with smears applied to the chopping frames. Now we can feel the overall arc, the path of motion, and the power of that chop. If we were to select those frames alone, I basically strobed the arm. Notice how he has a few extra forearms, or fingers, and how the wristbands fly off the arm graphically. Although stylized, the feeling of a blur is there. It doesn't need to make sense. Here is another approach, except more in an anime-looking smear. I only applied more smear to the hand alone because this is where I want most of the intensity to appear in the focal point of the animation. Again, a smear can look like anything. It just needs to describe the path of motion and that motion blur. Here is a macho guy, constantly doing quick macho man poses. Without the smear, there really is no motion at all. He just snaps into these poses. Now with smears, I can describe how fast and stylized the character can switch into these poses. There's more description in how his arms, his legs, and his body move, even if it's just a blink of an eye. If you have seen the cartoon show Johnny Bravo, that character is almost always moving in a smear. Here is a Bruce Lee wannabe doing 100 punches in light speed. This first pass is fine, but because it's moving so fast, again, it looks like it's blinking. Now, if we added smears, we have a clear indication and clear description of how fast or where the arms and fists are moving. This further strengthens and emphasizes his speed of his arms. It's all just a blur. That's how fast he is. But you know what? Something I didn't mention is that you can use smears to suggest extra movement, or suggest movements that you can't really see. Now here's another pass. Notice how this one doesn't really follow the necessary path of movement, but I've drawn multiple arms around the scene to indicate that there's more punches that we don't really see, or that's not really connected to his body. This is just to further elaborate on how many punches he's actually throwing. Here's a character doing quick movements and turns. Notice how I used the smears to describe this. I made multiple strobing eyes for the character, making it leave the head sometimes. This is a stylistic and graphical choice I made. To make the movement believable, please again be sure to follow the arcs and the path of motion within your animation to make it believable. You can use smears to deform the character if it helps describe and strengthen the movement and intensity. Smears are great for quick action scenes, stylized animation, and showing impact. However, use them with consideration. Using them in every single part of your animation might make your whole animation piece feel watery and stroby, and might defeat the intensity of some key movements. But remember, if it's the style of animation you're gunning for, then go all out. A smear is a tool after all. You can abuse it or use it gently. It's all up to you. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.